thank you for still having me in the slightly awkward ivory format. And thanks to the other two speakers of the session. I found the talks great, and I think actually a lot of what I have to say sort of dovetails a little bit on Hannah's talk. So that's good. I will be talking today about a new project that is sort of born out of the contribution that I wrote for Daryl's volume that was more focused on empathy, but as you'll see, that's still the direction. And I'm going to take it a little bit from far and start by talking about the concept of world traveling as developed by the feminist philosopher Lugones. She writes in her paper about playfulness, word traveling, and loving perception about what the conditions are under which we can more easily bridge social divide. And she thinks we should engage in what she called world traveling, which is what allows us to put ourselves in a vulnerable position where we explore others' values, norms, and attitudes that are unfamiliar to us. So she characterizes it a little bit metaphorically, but in very rich terms, as the ability to shed arrogant perception. So the ability to stop failing to see others as complete subjects, stop putting our own understanding at the forefront of our reasoning, the ability to abandon some of our strong assumptions of what others are and what the new environments are. But importantly, she thinks a good world traveler, so a person that engages with a new set of social norms, with a new world, as she calls it, is somebody that also experience themselves as different through the travel. So it's not just observing a new set of norms as a spectator with a third person sort of attitude, but also trying to self-construct and reinvent and reinvent when engaging with a new set of norms and a new set of people. And she thinks all of these things are necessary when we, for example, want to build feminist coalitions that bridge across race divides, or in general, build social coalitions to better understand each other. I think the quote works quite well. We are fully dependent on each other, she writes, for the possibility of being understood. And without this understanding, we're not intelligible. We do not make sense. We are not solid, visible, integrated. We are lacking. So traveling to each other's worlds would enable us to be thorough, loving each other. I'll get to why this is relevant to AI and chatbots in particular in a second, but first, a couple of things. So one thing she stresses is that word traveling involves friction. So it involves us stepping out of our comfort zone, we would probably say now, and embracing the fact that sometimes we need to be uneasy, uncomfortable when we are embracing new social norms, when we are embracing the reality of other people. And I think it's worth suggesting that some people have argued that this might be actually an hallmark of moral change in general. So in their work on moral progress, for example, Westra and Kelly have argued that the breakdown in fluency we experience with new norms is a sign we are changing and we need to retune to a new environment. So in a sense, the fact that there is friction is a sign that our moral psychology apparatus is working well. You still see me and hear me? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes, we could see and hear you. We do see your advancing slides on the right-hand side now. So
okay, perfect. Good. Something changed in the settings, so I just wanted to make sure. So, and I've argued in a more recent work with Daniel Kelly as well, that word traveling involves the capacity for what I will call for the rest of of the talk, code switching. So the ability to tune to our interlocutor to adopt their perspective, but also change the way we present ourselves and deal with our language, our body language, and a number of other things that communicate our identity. So cultural code switching in this framework entails the ability to adapt behavior to the social and cultural context we're in, and tailoring yourself to the social roles and demands of the new world we are experiencing. So what we're trying to do in many ways can be characterized as trying to give a cognitive story of what word traveling entails, in a sense. And we're doing this building on a number of things. First of all, the idea that good conversations, at least if not all conversations, are ground for interpersonal inquiry. So when we engage with each other in a meaningful way, what we're doing is, first of all, we're not just interested in gathering information about the other person, but we're interested in the process of the conversation. And we are also interested in abdicating sovereignty to some extent. So we let the perspective of others inform us on how we interpret, understand, and report ourselves. Potentially engaging in what I've called in other work acts of co-narrations. So we let the perspective of others involve the way we understand ourselves and not just each other. So getting to the chatbots, I think there are good reasons to think that word traveling as we describe it, as I've described it so far, and our code switching skills might actually be endangered for a number of reasons. So I'm not going to try to convince you that chatbots are the ultimate evil and the only evil or anything like that. I think there's a lot of nuance to be had here. And I also think there's reasons to think we could use these tools to improve our abilities. But I do think that the over-reliance on dialogues with chatbots might endanger our code switching and word traveling skills in at least two ways, and that it's worth talking about these things. The two ways I want to focus on today is the potential inhibition of our code switching abilities per se, and I'll say a bit more about that, and the elimination of good friction. So sometimes when I talk about these themes, I have to convince people that users do use chatbots to do emotional re-elaboration work, but I don't think this this audience actually needs that. I'm just going to present you with some quotes. Some are pulled from Reddit, and of course they've been picked appropriately, but I think what's important here is just to point out that some people do use these tools in ways that they at least conceive as helping them with, say, self-reflection and re-elaborating their own perspective. And I also want to briefly point out a couple of these quotes are quotes of people that lament the lack of empathy in others, while also, using very, very harsh language to describe everybody else around them. And we'll say a little bit more about that later. So this is just to say, there's definitely plenty of evidence, and we've seen some of that in other talks today as well, that there is a use of the chatbots to have those meaningful conversations we were talking about. So conversations that are about really understanding each other and potentially questioning our own understanding of who we are. And I'm going to now point at some other data that is often used to express worries that are on the cognitive level. So whereas I would argue we should be concerned we should be having concerns and conversations on the moral dimension. as well at the same time. So if you look at studies like Surati and colleagues, that's from last year, what they point at is that LLMs, when they're used to write, tend to, for example, erase unique linguistic signatures that convey personal traits. Basically, pointing to the fact that, as you can see in the purple quote, across data sets, we observe a consistent bias in LLM-generated text with writing styles often aligning with traits associated with older, male, politically liberal individuals and exhibiting positive moral balance and lower empathy. Of course, there's a lot of questions to be asked about how exactly you measure positive moral balance and lower empathy, and we can have a conversation about that. But what I think it's interesting and worth noticing is that this is not the only study pointing to a risk in flattening our ability to preserve linguistic diversity and what they call perspective diversity when we enter in dialogues with chatbots. So basically, these authors are saying, if you look at people using chatbots to write or express their thoughts, they do end up after the interactions and during the interactions expressing themselves in ways that are sort of all the same. So there is a little bit of homogenization going on. And this, I'm sure you're familiar with this because this has been in the news a lot and has been discussed in academic circles as a genuine concern about, for example, how our students are using these technologies and how that might invite them, invite them to set aside some of their own original thought or even diminish the very rich linguistic diversity on our campuses. And you probably also have encountered another version of this worry, which can be possibly summarized by appealing to this paper here on the screen. People have voiced concerns that really what happens when especially non-expert users use chatbot is that there is what they call cognitive surrender. So students especially seem to use this tool and not longer think too much about constructing their own answers. They tend to acritically accept the results that are out of the chatbot's interactions and so on. And this has been characterized in many ways on the media and in academic circles as a threat to the cognitive abilities of the students, right? So the skilling of that kind. And at the same time, there has been the moral de-skilling debate that has been pushed by people like Shannon Veller, who has been discussing the way technology can interfere with our moral development. There have been voiced concerns about what that entails, this homogenization threat entails for the cognitive skills of the students, especially, or all of us, really. I don't know about you, but I'm also quite concerned about people in the generation of my parents because they seem to be using these tools more than my students, really. And all of these concerns are good, but I am going to follow Shannon Veller for a second here and be more worried about the moral part than the cognitive part, even though the two arguably go together. So my worry said in a very simple way is that chatbot interlocutors might provide us with reduced possibilities for exercising our code switching skills in several ways. One is they provide us with linguistically and culturally impoverished interactions. I thought Lal's talk earlier today was really good in showing that. We know that these tools are not amazing at having conversation patterns that are not the ones of the average white American guy. And there are numerous reasons to worry about that. But I think one of the reasons is that they just don't really invite us to code switch in that sense. And I think one specific lens under which we should analyze this is the fact that they might be removing us from interactions that are grounds for assessing both ours and our interlocutors' identity complexity. So one of the things we explore in our code switching work, Dan and I, is the fact that all of us really wear different hats in our social lives, and this is a good thing. And we have to develop the ability to switch from one hat to the other to actually be able to develop and enrich different aspects of our life and identity. And that's what it's referred to very often as identity complexity. And the fact is that there are studies showing that appreciating the identity complexity in ourselves and others actually correlates with the propensity to collaborate and coordinate with people that are not in our in-group, for example. And I think there's also reasons to think that the ability to really understand how complex others are in our identity, in their identities and values, might be part of that perspective switching that people like McGeer think is a fundamental aspect of our moral agency. So the ability to really, in Lugones terms, world travel, to actually understand others. So the other thing that might worry us that doesn't have to be characterized in terms of code switching is what I've referred to as the removal of good friction. And at this point, I'm assuming you are expecting me to talk about psychopathic tendencies. Like Brett, I cannot really pronounce this word. I'm sorry. Though in my case, I suspect it's a much more permanent problem. But anyway, I think that's definitely part of it. But I also think there's philosophical work that has already discussed that in more depth than I can do now. I've already said a little bit about that in the chapter I wrote for the volume that I mentioned, and there's new material coming out every day. I would actually like to focus for a second on a different kind of friction that I fear might be removed from these interactions. So chatbot communication has some of the hallmarks of what we normally take to be asynchronous communication, in the sense that it is written and there is no body that we have to interpret, right? So when we chat with a chatbot, it's, as people have already said in much more eloquent terms before, it's a disembodied experience, at least in some sense. There is no pragmatic interpretation of tone, for example, of bodily cues, right? And these features apply to chatbot interactions, but they also apply to other forms of communications with humans, of course, that are normally asynchronous, like text messaging. But one thing that can happen with text and doesn't really happen with chatbots is waiting. So the tools are actually designed to provide us with answers right away, with responses to our concerns or whatever we're expressing in the immediate. But I would argue that the time that elapses between a question and an answer in any interaction can actually be very informative of the mental and physical life of our interlocutor and of the world happening around us. So if a friend doesn't respond to a text for a couple of days, that actually tells me something about what's happening to them in their life. It is informative of their world. It might also be informative of their lack of attention towards me, of course. But the crucial part is that it could also just be telling me something about what they're living. And it's a reminder that they are a person with their own world and set of values and priorities going on. This really obviously doesn't happen. Replica has been mentioned several times before. It's the AI companions who cares, and it's crucially always there for you. But I would argue waiting can be good friction because it's a temporal, it reminds us that our temporal dimension, our own time, the elapsed time that we experience, is not the only temporal dimension that matters in an interaction. And I think it could be characterized as a form of world traveling by subtraction in this sense, because absences and silences are informative of our duties towards others as well. So before concluding, I know I've talked at this point 20 minutes. And I know that you have a lunch coming up, whereas it's dinner time for me. A few notes that actually relate a lot to what Hannah has been talking about before. So there are multiple reasons to worry about this at an individual level, but actually what I'm most concerned about is the systemic and more structural consequences. If I'm right, and code switching abilities developed in these conversations and are endangered by our reliance on chatbots, then we have not just individual problems at hand, but more systemic problems at hand. So Lugones points out that those who are outsiders to the mainstream are forced to practice word traveling out of necessity, right? She talks about the experience of non-white women, for example, that have to word travel a lot because people don't travel to their world, right? And Morton, in her great work on code switching, basically points to a similar problem, saying class strivers and minorities already accuse the reputational damage that often comes with being a code switcher, because we tend to see people that code switch as lacking authenticity, as being duplicitous, as people that are living a different life. And a lot of that has to do with our, I would argue, general misunderstanding of what code switching really is morally, but a lot of that also has to do with injustice, right? Because a lot of us don't have to adapt to others as interlocutors as much as other people need to. To decrease our collective repertoire of interactions that are ground for word traveling is, among other things, to risk another injustice. So an unfair and an even more unfair distribution of emotional and psychological work, because code switching is actually demanding, just like empathy is. It's an effort, it's labor. And these present some problems, right? So in the worst cases, I think we would turn to people that are already burdened to exercise empathy, perspective taking, and code switching. So minorities, once again, for example, or along gender divides, and so on. And in the best cases, we might turn to them just to relieve the awkwardness of interactions that are characterized by poor tuning to each other and poor code switching and word traveling. In any case, this is an injustice, and it's something that we should be concerned about at a more structured and collective level. So to conclude, word traveling is a skill we exercise with others across conversations and interactions. It includes friction and effortful code switching. If I'm right and chatbot dialogues are a threat to this skill, they are certainly not the only one, and perhaps they don't have to be a threat to this skill. But I do think this deserves an analysis of the friction they lift and the modality of communication they promote. Thank you so much. Sorry for the technical issues.
Sorry for the tech issues in the room. We'll take one question and then probably have to break.
Hey, Leda. Excellent talk. So I love the good friction considerations, and I just want to say that's all right, and then ask you how far you would want to push this, because a lot of, there's been a little bit of a tension in the way that people think about this stuff, where it's like, on the one hand, what we want to do is we want to just give people more or less what they want. And on the other hand, we have various thoughts about what it is in fact good for people to want. Maybe even thoughts that if they themselves were presented with this information, they would endorse, but they don't tend to endorse, just sort of on the day-to-day. And there's one version of the AI quote unquote alignment stuff that's just let's just get this in line with people's actual judgments. That seems to lose out on the kind of good friction stuff that we might not be thinking about. about when we're making first order judgments about what we want from a machine learning model. And so then there's this other thing, but as soon as you start introducing sort of reflective like stuff that it is good for us to want, even if in the moment it's kind of painful for us, as soon as you introduce that, then it's like, where do you stop before it's just like, well, first figure out the true moral theory and then the true moral theory in your model, right? Like, so how do you see where you fall along that sort of more demandingness spectrum?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brett. That's a great question. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the tension that I'm trying to work with right now for a number of reasons. And okay, so maybe I can just be direct on that in a way. One thing that I want to develop out of this is actually an account of what good friction is in interactions in general. Because I think what this made me realize is that it's really unclear in a lot of our interactions what counts as good moral friction and what counts as bad friction, because obviously that exists as well. And if you think about accounts, for example, of gaslighting or what abuse looks like from a moral perspective, obviously they point to the extremes. So like this, so we know what really bad friction is, and we know what perfect harmony and lack of friction is. But what we need to figure out is what is a good challenge to our moral skills, what is a good invitation to take the perspective of others that is not damaging our own autonomy, for example, or our more general aims. So I know in a way this evades the question, but I think the reason why it's such a good question is that it doesn't just apply to our concerns about AI and conversation or alignment, so to say, but it applies more in general, what we want from interaction. And I would argue we don't need an account of what the good moral theory is, but maybe an account of what a good moral interaction is to solve that, if that makes sense.
That was a thumbs up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Leda. Thank you, Leda, for joining us.